Imagine waking up to a letter on your doorstep. It's not a friendly note from a neighbor, or a package you forgot you ordered. It's a fine. A printed, bold, official-looking notice from the Homeowners Association, your HOA. The reason? Your lawn has too many wildflowers, or maybe your grass is an inch too tall. Something ridiculous. Something petty. You sigh. You've lived a peaceful life, kept to yourself, never caused a problem in the neighborhood. And now this. Over a yard. But here's the real kicker. The person issuing the fine isn't just a concerned neighbor. It's the HOA president, a person who seems to take their job a little too seriously. You know the type. Clipboard in hand. Walking around with a permanent scowl, inspecting everyone's property like a drill sergeant. The kind of person who enjoys their power just a bit too much. They don't knock. They don't ask. They just fine. And here's the funny part. While this person is acting like they're the judge, jury, and executioner of the neighborhood, they have no clue who you are. Because you're not just another homeowner. You're not someone who'll be intimidated by a notice on your door or a threat of penalty. You're a Supreme Court judge. You've spent your life interpreting laws, upholding justice, and navigating the complexities of the legal system. You know exactly how rules should work, and more importantly, how power should work. And this HOA power play. It's not justice. It's ego. But you're calm. You've dealt with bigger problems. You don't need to yell or make a scene. You let the paper crinkle between your fingers as you read the fine again. It's full of vague language. No citations. No proper clause from the HOA bylaws. Just a demand for payment and a subtle threat about further action if you don't comply. You smirk a little. It's not about the money, of course. It's the principle. You look out your window at the front yard. It's neat. Green. Maintained. Maybe not perfect, but certainly nothing that deserves a fine. And even if it did, there's a proper way to handle it. A conversation. A warning. Not this paper-thin display of authority. Your neighborhood is quiet. Peaceful, usually. But you've noticed something lately. More and more neighbors whispering about the HOA president's behavior. People afraid to speak out. Afraid of being fined. So they cut their lawns shorter than they want to. They hide garden gnomes. They repaint their mailboxes just to avoid trouble. You shake your head. This isn't what a community should feel like. You go inside, set the fine on your kitchen table, and make a cup of coffee. You're not angry. You're interested. Curious, even. You wonder how far this HOA president will go. How many people they've already intimidated. You wonder if they understand the rules they're supposed to enforce. You wonder if they even care. You sit down with your coffee and open your laptop. Time to take a look at those HOA bylaws. You've seen hundreds of legal documents, but these are something else. Sloppily written. Confusing. A few sections contradict themselves. One clause about landscaping doesn't even define what acceptable means. You chuckle. It's almost too easy. Meanwhile, the HOA president probably thinks they've put you in your place. Maybe they imagine you scrambling to fix your yard. Maybe they're already drafting another fine. But they're in for a surprise. Because tomorrow, you'll show up to the HOA meeting. Quietly. Calmly. No robe, no title, no theatrics. Just a homeowner who knows the rules better than the people who made them. And when you speak, it won't be loud. It won't be angry. But it will change everything. Because power used carelessly doesn't last long. And respect isn't something you can demand with a clipboard. It has to be earned. And this story, well, it's just getting started. The neighborhood looked like something out of a magazine. Perfect lawns. Fresh paint. Trimmed bushes. Every driveway had the same smooth concrete. Every mailbox looked the same. The kind of place where nothing ever seemed out of place until you looked a little closer. Because beneath the calm surface, there was tension. The kind that builds slowly, quietly. The kind no one talks about, but everyone feels. And at the center of it all stood one man, the HOA president. He was always around. Always watching. Every morning, like clockwork, He walked the neighborhood with a notebook in hand. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stared. And wrote things down. He lived for the rules. Not for safety. Not for fairness. For control. And today, he had found a new target. A yard that didn't meet his silent standards. Not overgrown. Not messy. Just different. A few native plants instead of manicured flowers. A natural, eco-friendly look instead of the uniform turf he seemed to expect. That's what triggered the fine. No conversation. No knock on the door. Just a piece of paper slipped into the mailbox. A penalty. A warning. He probably thought he was being efficient. In control. Showing the neighborhood who was boss. But the person he had just fined wasn't a clueless homeowner. They weren't scared. Or confused. They were a retired Supreme Court judge. A person who had spent decades upholding laws that affected millions. Who had heard cases that shaped the country. Who had written legal opinions now studied in law schools. A person who understood not just what laws say, but why they matter. And that person was now sipping coffee, reading the HOA's poorly written letter, and thinking one thing. This is going to be interesting. It wasn't about pride. It wasn't about revenge. It was about principle. Because when people in power forget the meaning of fairness, someone has to remind them. Inside the judge's home, the walls were lined with books. Legal texts, historical volumes, old court cases, handwritten notes from a lifetime of service. But none of that mattered to the HOA president. He didn't know who lived behind that door. He didn't care. All he saw was a lawn he didn't like. And he thought that gave him the right to punish someone. That's how entitled people work. They act like rules are weapons instead of guides. They enjoy the feeling of control, not the responsibility that comes with it. The judge saw that clearly. He'd seen it in courtrooms, in politics, even in everyday people. And now, in his own neighborhood. He opened the HOA bylaws again, reading line by line. The document was full of vague phrases and contradictions. There were no proper definitions, no clear standards for what counted as a violation. Just open-ended language, ripe for abuse. And the president was using it, confident no one would challenge him. That was about to change. The judge didn't call anyone. Didn't write a complaint. He just kept reading, highlighting sections, jotting notes in the margins. Like he'd done hundreds of times before. Later that day, he took a walk around the block. Not to confront. Just to observe. Neighbors waved. Some looked nervous. One even whispered, "Did you get a notice too?" That's when it became clear, this wasn't just a personal issue. The HOA president had created a pattern. People were afraid to speak out. Afraid to plant the wrong flowers. Afraid to leave a garden hose out too long. Afraid of fines. The judge gave a small nod. He understood now. This wasn't just about his yard. It was about the whole community. And so he returned home, made a few more notes, and circled the date of the next HOA meeting on his calendar. It would be his first time attending. He'd never needed to before. But things were different now. Because the HOA president thought he had power. Thought he could enforce anything, no matter how unreasonable. Thought no one would stop him. But power without accountability is a dangerous thing. And this neighborhood was about to learn that sometimes, the quietest voice in the room holds the most weight. The day of the HOA meeting arrived without fanfare. No drama. No noise. Just a quiet Tuesday evening where most people would rather be at home with dinner than sitting in a stuffy community room. But tonight was different. Something was in the air. The judge walked in alone. No robe. No entourage. Just a notepad in hand and a calm expression. He took a seat near the back, unnoticed by most, except a few neighbors who gave polite nods or quick glances. Some recognized him. Most didn't. The HOA president sat at the front table, just like he always did. Straight posture, crisp polo shirt, and the same tired speech about maintaining standards and protecting property values. He spoke with authority. With routine. As if everything he said was law. But this time, someone was actually listening. Item after item was ticked off the agenda. Tree branches hanging over fences. Mailboxes with chipped paint. Someone's backyard shed was apparently an inch too tall. Each issue met with the same tone. Stern, disapproving, final. Then it came time for homeowner concerns. And the judge stood up. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to be heard. He introduced himself simply. His name. His address. A homeowner, like everyone else. And then, he pulled out the fine. The room quieted. I received this notice last week, he began. It claims that my yard is in violation of Section 3.4 of the HOA's landscaping policy. He paused. I've reviewed Section 3.4. It's vague. It doesn't define what constitutes a violation. It doesn't provide measurements, standards, or examples. It just says that landscaping must be in accordance with community aesthetics. A few people shifted in their seats. Some looked down. One woman furrowed her brow, as if realizing something for the first time. The president cleared his throat. Sir, our policies are clear and have been enforced consistently for years. The judge nodded politely. I understand. But consistency does not equal legality. He flipped a page in his notes. You see, vague terms like community aesthetics are subjective. And when rules are subjective, enforcement becomes arbitrary. That's where fairness breaks down. That's where power gets misused. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He explained. Carefully. Clearly. Like he was teaching, not scolding. He pointed out sections where the HOA bylaws contradicted one another. Where penalties were issued without procedure. Where residents had no defined path to appeal a decision. All facts. All rooted in the text of the HOA's own documents. And then, without announcing it, he dropped the truth. I've served as a Supreme Court judge. My job for decades was to interpret the law, to understand the limits of power, and to protect people from misuse of it. What I see here is not enforcement. It's entitlement. What I see is a pattern of decisions that are more about personal preference than policy. Silence filled the room. Even the president blinked slowly, suddenly aware of who he was speaking to. But the judge wasn't done. This isn't just about my yard, he continued. This is about all of us. Every homeowner here. If one person can be fined for something that's not clearly defined, then anyone can. And that's not a community. That's control. People started nodding. A few muttered agreements. The mood in the room had shifted. Completely. The president tried to respond. Tried to regain control. But his words came out flatter now, less confident. The judge sat down. And just like that, the dynamic changed. Not because he yelled. Not because he demanded anything. But because he spoke the truth, and people listened. No one had ever questioned the HOA like this before. No one had stood up and calmly pulled back the curtain. Not until now. And while the president shuffled his notes and moved on with the meeting, the air in the room was different. Tense. A little charged. Like everyone suddenly saw things a bit more clearly. One neighbor leaned over to another and whispered, "Did you know he was a judge?" The reply came quietly, "No. But I'm glad he's here." The meeting ended without applause, but something had definitely changed. People left slower than usual. They lingered by the doors, whispering, exchanging glances. The usual brisk walk to their cars had turned into clusters of quiet conversation. For once, the community wasn't just nodding and going along with things. They were thinking. And the president. He walked out quickly, barely looking up from his binder. His posture had stiffened. His usual air of confidence had thinned, just enough to notice. The judge didn't follow him. He didn't need to. He knew that sometimes the biggest impact comes not from confrontation, but from clarity. When people see the truth, it sticks with them. It changes how they look at everything around them, even something as small as a yard. The next morning, the fine was gone. No explanation. No apology. Just quietly removed from the system, as if it never existed. Like someone had hit delete and hoped no one would ask questions. But people were asking questions. It started with a knock at the judge's door. A neighbor. Middle-aged man, nervous smile. He thanked the judge for speaking up. Said he'd received 3 fines in the past year for things he didn't even know were violations. He'd paid them without arguing. Said he was afraid of causing trouble. Then came an email from another neighbor. Then a phone call. Then 2 more knocks. People who had felt powerless for years now had something they hadn't had before, a voice. And someone who showed them they weren't alone. The judge listened to all of them. He didn't promise to fix everything. He just listened. Took notes. Gave advice where it made sense. Reminded them they had the right to ask questions, to see the bylaws, to challenge vague policies. The word started to spread. By the end of the week, several residents had formed a small group. Nothing official, just a gathering of concerned homeowners who wanted to understand their rights. They met in living rooms. Shared copies of the HOA rules. Talked about what had been happening. Quiet fines, strange restrictions, no clear process for challenging decisions. For the first time in a long time, the HOA president wasn't the one controlling the conversation. And that made him nervous. A week later, a new memo went out from the HOA office. It was worded carefully, almost politely. It said the board would be reviewing current enforcement procedures and inviting feedback from homeowners. A surprise, considering the same board used to send warnings if your garbage can stayed at the curb too long. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew what had caused the shift. One voice. One meeting. One person willing to speak up. But the judge didn't take credit. That wasn't his goal. He wasn't trying to be a hero or stir up drama. He just wanted fairness. Consistency. A community that felt like, well, a community, not a playground for someone who mistook a title for authority. He still took care of his yard. Still went for his morning walks. Still waved to neighbors passing by. But now, they stopped to chat. They asked questions. They shared their own stories. And more importantly, they started showing up. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. People who hadn't attended a single meeting in years suddenly found themselves reading bylaws, scribbling notes, raising hands. They weren't angry. They weren't aggressive. They were informed. And that made all the difference. The president tried to run things like before, but it didn't work the same. His voice didn't carry the same weight. His decisions were questioned, not rudely, but directly. He was forced to explain, to provide evidence, to follow the rules he had once enforced so loosely. The power dynamic had shifted. Not because someone shouted, but because someone showed everyone what power really looks like when it's grounded in knowledge, patience, and quiet strength. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the judge stood with his arms crossed, watching the conversation unfold, not leading it, just making sure it stayed on track. The HOA still existed. The rules still mattered. But now, so did the people. The third HOA meeting since the judge spoke out was even more crowded than the last. Folding chairs had to be brought in from the storage room. A few people stood along the walls, arms crossed, watching every word exchanged at the front table. The atmosphere wasn't tense, just alert. People were paying attention now. No one was dozing off or quietly scrolling on their phones like before. This time, when the HOA president walked in, he looked different. Not rushed, not scowling, but careful. Like someone who knew the spotlight was on them. Like someone who had finally realized the neighborhood wasn't sleeping anymore. As the meeting kicked off, the topics were familiar. Landscaping, fences, holiday decorations. But the tone had changed. The board spoke more clearly, paused more often, asked for feedback. It almost felt reasonable. People started speaking up more too. A younger couple asked why solar panels were still being discouraged in a state that encouraged green energy. A retired woman asked for clarification on fence height rules because she'd been given 2 different answers. Another neighbor brought up a confusing section in the bylaws and asked if it could be rewritten more clearly. The president, once quick to brush off questions, now paused to listen. He nodded. Took notes. Occasionally looked over at the judge, as if checking whether he was saying the right thing. The judge didn't speak this time. He sat near the back again, quiet, observant. Letting the community lead. That had been the plan all along, Not to take over, not to be in charge, but to make space for others to speak and be heard. What had started with one fine had become something much bigger. Outside the meetings, things were changing too. Neighbors who had never spoken were now exchanging phone numbers. Group chats had formed to keep each other updated on HOA matters. People were more open, more connected. The kind of small talk that once felt forced now came naturally. Talk of weekend barbecues, garden tips, or just checking in. The community felt less like a collection of houses and more like a neighborhood. The HOA president, for all his past behavior, hadn't resigned. And honestly, the judge hadn't expected him to. Power rarely walks away on its own. But even if the president hadn't changed, the rules had. Because now, he wasn't the only one who knew them. One morning, the judge got another knock on his door. This time, it was a teenage boy from down the street. He looked nervous, holding a clipboard and wearing a t-shirt with the neighborhood's name printed across the chest. He explained that he was doing a project for school, something about local governance. He'd heard about what happened at the meeting weeks ago. He wanted to know how HOA rules worked, what made them fair or unfair, and how people could challenge them if needed. The judge invited him in. He didn't give a lecture. He didn't pull out legal books. He just talked about responsibility, about how small systems matter just as much as big ones. How it's easy to overlook things like HOA bylaws, but those little details shape people's daily lives more than they realize. That conversation stretched on for over an hour. When the boy left, he thanked the judge and said something that stuck. "I thought this stuff was boring, but now it actually makes sense." That was the thing no one had expected. The ripple effect. Because once one person questions unfairness, it gives everyone else permission to do the same. It shows that it's not rude to speak up. It's not disruptive to ask for clarity. It's necessary. Weeks passed. The weather changed. Lawns grew, were trimmed, and grew again. But this time, no one was afraid of getting a fine just because a flower bloomed in the wrong spot. The judge kept his routine. Walks. Reading. Quiet mornings. But now, when people saw him on the sidewalk, they waved. Some stopped to chat. Some smiled and said thanks. Not just for speaking up, but for showing them they could too. And the neighborhood kept moving forward. Not perfect. Not without disagreement. But awake. By the time summer rolled around, the neighborhood looked the same on the outside. Green lawns, trimmed bushes, kids on scooters, but the feeling was different. Quieter in the best way. Not silent. Just calm. Like people had taken a deep breath they didn't know they'd been holding. The HOA meetings were now something people actually looked forward to. Not because they loved rules and regulations, but because it was one of the only times everyone gathered in one place. There were handshakes now. First names. People brought cookies to share. Someone even started printing out agendas with little notes in the margins, like suggested edits and need to revisit this. And the judge. He didn't sit at the back anymore. He still wasn't at the front either. He'd usually take a spot off to the side, watching, listening, only speaking when he had something useful to add. He didn't want to lead the HOA. He wasn't looking for a title. He just wanted things to be better. And they were. One day, during a walk around the block, a neighbor caught up to him. A woman in her 40s, jogging shoes, earbuds in her hand. She said hi, then slowed to walk beside him for a bit. She thanked him, not for that first meeting, not even for pushing back against the fine, but for making her care again. She said she used to ignore everything the HOA did. The fines, the notices, the rules. She paid them when she had to, grumbled when they annoyed her, and just hoped not to get singled out. But after hearing him speak, she started reading the bylaws. She started asking questions. Now, she helped draft changes. She even planned to run for a board seat next year. That was the thing. The change wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was steady. People stopped fearing the board. They started participating. There were still disagreements, of course. There were still awkward moments when people didn't see eye to eye. But those moments didn't turn into fights. They turned into conversations. And slowly, the old patterns, The sneaky fines, the silent control, the power trips, they started to vanish. The president remained in his position, but even he was different now. Whether it was humility or pressure, something had shifted in him. He spoke less, listened more. He no longer walked around with a clipboard in hand. He didn't look over people's fences anymore. He stayed in his lane. Not because he suddenly became generous, but because now, people were watching. There was accountability. And it made all the difference. One evening, the judge sat on his porch, sipping tea and reading a book. A breeze moved through the trees. Kids laughed in the distance. The smell of grilled burgers drifted from someone's backyard. Then came another knock. This time, it wasn't a complaint or a thank you. It was an invitation. A small group of neighbors was organizing a community review night, a casual event where anyone could bring up a concern or suggest a new idea for the HOA. Nothing formal. No voting. Just talking. Just listening. They asked the judge if he'd come. Not to speak. Just to be there. He smiled and said he would. That night, they gathered in someone's garage, folding chairs scattered across the floor, fairy lights strung up for fun. There was lemonade. Snacks. A whiteboard with the title, "How Can We Do Better?" One by one, people spoke. A mix of small ideas, plant swaps, tool-sharing sheds, dog waste bag stations. But also bigger things, clarifying bylaws, supporting elderly neighbors, giving people more time to fix violations before issuing fines. The judge listened. Took it all in. And in that garage, with the laughter, the scribbled ideas, and the sound of people actually working together, he realized something. It had never been about winning. Not the fine. Not the meeting. Not even the shift in power. It had always been about showing people what they were allowed to do all along. Speak up. Question things. Work together. And most importantly, care. The neighborhood kept evolving in small, steady ways. It wasn't perfect, and nobody expected it to be. There were still disagreements about paint colors and where exactly trash bins should be stored. But now, those disagreements didn't feel like battles, they felt like conversations. More and more, the neighbors weren't just reacting to HOA decisions. They were shaping them. There was a new rhythm to things. Before, the board decided and the residents adjusted. Now, it felt like everyone had a hand on the wheel. People started volunteering for things they used to avoid. A quiet man who'd lived on the corner for over a decade suddenly stepped up to redesign the neighborhood's outdated welcome sign. A single mom who never attended a meeting before volunteered to help rewrite the outdated pet policy. Even the teenagers pitched in, creating a digital suggestion box that anyone could use anonymously. And slowly, the rulebook was changing too. Vague language was replaced with specifics. Outdated policies were reviewed one by one. New ones were drafted based on feedback, not just preference. The board wasn't above the community anymore, they were part of it. One rule that used to stand out was the infamous aesthetic harmony clause, the same one the judge had been fined under. It had always been open to interpretation, which meant it had been used as a weapon more than once. Now, it had been rewritten entirely. Clear, fair, objective, and most importantly, understood by everyone. The judge never took credit for the change. He didn't need to. He knew that real change didn't come from a single person demanding it. It came when people saw what was broken and decided they could fix it together. There were moments when the old habits tried to creep back in. A board member suggested reinstituting random yard inspections just to keep things clean. But the idea was quickly challenged, not with anger, but with questions. Why? What problem would it solve? What process would protect fairness? It didn't go anywhere. Because now, no decision went unexamined. A few months after the first community review night, the neighborhood held its annual block party. Normally, it was a small affair, some folding tables, a few coolers, a grill. But this time, it was different. Word had spread. People had started talking more, helping more, feeling invested. And so they showed up. Families brought dishes. Kids decorated the sidewalk with chalk. Someone set up a music playlist. Others organized lawn games. People who barely waved at each other a year ago now stood shoulder to shoulder, laughing like they'd known each other forever. The judge arrived late, carrying a pie and a folding chair. He wasn't swarmed with attention, and he didn't expect to be. But nearly every person he passed greeted him. A nod. A handshake. A warm smile. One of the board members, a younger guy, recently elected, sat down beside him and handed him a plate. He leaned in and said, "I used to think HOA stuff didn't matter. Then I realized, it's not about the rules. It's about how we treat each other through them." The judge nodded slowly, not needing to say much. He knew exactly what that meant. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the string lights lit up across the street, something small but important happened. The HOA president approached the judge. He didn't come with attitude. He wasn't holding a folder or checklist. He came with his hands in his pockets and a hesitant look on his face. He said thank you. Not for the challenge, not for the pressure, but for the reminder. That leadership isn't about control. It's about trust. And that trust doesn't come from power, it comes from being fair, being open, and being willing to listen when it matters. The judge shook his hand, not to make peace, but to mark a moment. Because the truth was, that handshake didn't mean everything was perfect now. But it meant things were moving forward. One step. One neighbor. One rule at a time. And in the soft hum of laughter, music, and clinking cups, it was clear the neighborhood wasn't just surviving under the weight of rules anymore. It was learning how to grow. Together.